Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Bienvenue à Montréal. Également, bienvenue à l'hiver. C'est arrivé, finalement, un peu tôt, peut-être. Le sujet du jour est la politique publique. Je m'appelle Chris Reagan, je suis directeur de l'école Max Bell, et le sujet est la complexité de la politique. Why is it so difficult? Why is a good idea not enough to get good policy? That's what this is all about. There are many problems out there. There are many good ideas. And academics are famous for thinking about good ideas to solve big problems, but somehow a good idea doesn't seem to be enough. So today is all about the many ways that policy and the policy process is complex and why you need more than just a good idea to get good policy. And you've all seen the program, so you know what's coming, so I don't have to describe it for you. I want to give you just 3 quick housekeeping details, and then I'm going to get us started with the first panel. Number 1, if you want Wi-Fi in your blue program, there are some instructions about how to get onto Wi-Fi. Cell phones, pretend you are in a movie theater, folks. So this is the time to turn your cell phones off so that you are not speaking on them and nobody is calling to you, and if they do, you don't know about it. And the third thing is, if you are on social media, and we are delighted if you are on social media, then hashtag better policy. Hashtag better policy is how you can convey information about this conference. So without further ado, I'd like to get the first panel started, and I'm just going to introduce the moderator, and he will introduce his panel. The moderator for this panel, and this panel is the basics, if you like, about why good ideas aren't enough. So people to talk about communications, stakeholder engagement, engagement and understanding of the political process, and other parts of the complex policy puzzle. The moderator is Paul Booth. Paul Booth is an economist. Is that a good thing or a bad thing in the eyes of the audience? I think it's a great thing. Paul Booth spent many years as an economist at the University of Alberta. He also has lots of experience in the real world of policy making. He's been Deputy Minister of Finance in Saskatchewan. He's been the Deputy Minister of Environment federally. Actually, before that, he was an Associate Deputy Minister in the Department of Finance federally. So he has been around the block in terms of both thinking about policy and about implementing policy. And I'm going to invite him to the stage now, and he can introduce his panelists, and we'll get going. And at the end of each panel, for about 15 minutes, there's going to be an opportunity for questions from the audience, and maybe even answers from the panelists. We'll see how that turns out.
Maybe I could invite my colleagues to come up and take their seats. So we've got a great group this morning to start things off. I'll just go to my far left. Is Ken Boessenkool, who's a partner at Kool, Topp and Guy. Ken has a tremendous amount of experience in the political world, but also as a policy researcher. And some of his early work was as an author at the C.D. Howe Institute. Dan Tish is the CEO of Argyle. Dan is what I would call a strategist and knows both the strategy side of policy making and has worked with all 3 orders of government in Canada, but also the communication side. The same is true of Velma. Velma McColl is a principal at Earnscliffe. Again, worked with federal cabinet ministers on strategy and communications, and also worked in the provinces, and very well known for her work on sustainable development and and climate change. And finally, Bruce Lourie is the president of the Ivey Foundation. Very well known in the philanthropy world and advancing public policy through Ivey, but also an author of several books. So we have a great group here, and Chris gave us an assignment, and that was to start things off by telling you two things. One is, if you're going to be successful with good policy, what is one thing you must do? And the second is, what's one thing you must not do? So all the panelists have agreed to be pithy and conversational. And so with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Bruce to get us started. Bruce.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. And of course, the one thing you do is break the rules, and the one thing is more than one thing. I think really the one thing that you do is think big and try to think differently. And I think often in public policy, the starting point is we're stuck in some existing frame, and often we have to get ourselves out of that. I would say the one thing to not do is to start off trying to over-understand or overestimate what the political challenges will be in your public policy. You have to start off thinking what is the best thing for public policy, the best thing for the public, and go with that and try to convince the policymakers and politicians as opposed to overthink their opposition.
Great, thank you. Velma, what about you?
So I work at what I would call the applied end of public policy. Very tactical, very on the ground. And I would say the one thing, and I'm going to follow your rule, because mine is a package. The thing you have to do is you have to understand your landscape, you have to execute with discipline, and you have to adapt based on the circumstances that are in front of you. And the one thing not to do is to underestimate the number of people that you have to bring along with you. Whoa, including that person, whoever that was. The number of people you have to bring along with you in order to close. Because it's not enough in public policy to it's great to get your idea out there, but in the applied public policy world, and for most of you in this room, what we're interested in is making change. And if you want to close, you have to bring people with you.
Mm-hmm. Great, Dan.
Well, I got my start the hard way in political communications or policy-oriented communications when I worked in the Mulroney government early in my career. And so we had the GST and we had the Charlottetown Accord, right? One was implemented, one was not, but the cost of implementing one in terms of political payback afterwards were very severe. So a very early learning for me way back then, and something which has stuck with me throughout my whole career, is that the one thing you have to do is you have to think about how to integrate your policy with your communications. And I'll give Ken credit for saying something in our warm-up call, which was good policy badly communicated is bad policy. And the thing not to do is take no for an answer, in that I think good policy making, good policies and good communication around policies mean being persistent, showing initiative, building relationships over time. And so if you think about virtually every major good policy idea, it started as something unthinkable. And so no doesn't mean no in policy terms. In policy terms, no doesn't mean no, it means not yet. And I think a smart strategist will keep that in mind.
Ken, over to you.
Thank you. Policy must be serious. And that means well-researched, well-understood, and as a political person, you must not be afraid to reach out to those in the academic and other communities to ask them what they think about your policy ideas. I'm looking at Andrew Leach right now, who's very good at answering calls from people like me. So policy must be serious. What you must not do is let your polling drive your policy. There's a proper place for polling in the policy world, but it's not to let your polling drive your policy. That's always a disaster.
So that's a great start and a lot of disparate ideas. One of the things that that I wonder about when I'm listening to you all, I mean, you've all given ideas of, or ideas about what's needed for things to work or not work. Can you give us some examples? Give us an example of something that illustrates either the thing that worked or didn't work. I mean, we heard about the GST and the Charlottetown Accord, but I think to really crystallize this, an example of what you're talking about would be really helpful. Ken, why don't we go back to you and work our way this direction?
You mentioned that I worked at the CD Howe, and when I was working at the CD Howe, I spent about a third of my time looking at the tax treatment of the family and looking at how the tax treatment of the family was very generous to dual income families, but much less generous to single income families. And I wrote a paper that had a line in it that said, kids are not boats. And the idea was that all children in all families are worthy of some sort of tax deduction. And Canada was one of the only OECD countries that didn't provide universal benefits for children, although we originally had done that in 1945. Fast forward 10 years later, when I was writing the platform for Stephen Harper for most of his career, and this idea that all families are deserving of a recognition in the tax system was what was at the core of our idea of $100 per kid, and this idea of choice in childcare. And so the choice in childcare was the communication side of it. But at the core of this idea was something that I had been working on for over 10 years. And that debate became the central debate of the 2006 election. It was Paul Martin's universal institutionalization of children, which is how I call it, versus the $100 per kid from Stephen Harper. And we so soundly won that debate, both intellectually and politically, that now Justin Trudeau's thing in the window is benefits for children. And so that's an idea where the intellectual arguments were made and then became into the political realm. So it was a serious policy with serious background and serious work.
The other thing I take from that is patience. 10 years is not too long for policies to go from idea to result. Yeah. Dan, you mentioned GST and Charlottetown.
Yeah.
Do you want to expand on those or have another one to?
Well, I'm still suffering post-traumatic stress disorder from those, so even all these years. But the example I thought I'd use, though, which is the reason that as a Queens guy I feel very much at home in this room, is because there are a lot of people, including Chris Reagan and many others I see here, who worked on the Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. And for me, as one of the key members of the communications team for that, it was a profoundly rewarding experience. And if you think about why that was successful in both policy and communications terms, and I think it's fair to say it's been incredibly successful in taking carbon pricing from something likely due to good communications by Mr. Harper in 2008, and the wrong messenger in Mr. Dion, for all of his strengths, the wrong messenger, and maybe the wrong time. You look at what happened, right? It was really important to depolarize that debate, to not make it as something where it's a zero-sum game between the economy and the environment. So the messengers became very important, right? So the idea that we're going to have a group of economics who are approaching this through an economics lens, policy economics lens, the idea that we're going to have political advisors from across the spectrum, including Preston Manning and Jean Charest and many others, and then that we're not going to go out there and take a hard stand as to the way this should be done. To make the whole issue about carbon pricing not about if it happens, but when it happens, and just positioning it as a very practical economic decision. I think that early positioning was very important to, over time, getting policy team after policy team and ministry after ministry, province after province, and at the national level, aligned around bringing forward different options and making it more politically acceptable, at least enough for the Prime Minister and the premiers who were disposed enough to the idea to rally around it and come to a consensus. Now, obviously, polarization happened after that, which is another important lesson. There's often no finish line in policy-oriented communications, even when you think the battle is won. But I think that that's a really good illustration of how you can move the meter gradually over time and ultimately achieve something very powerful.
As an eco-fiscal commissioner, I appreciate that, but I think you're right that we haven't perfected alignment of all parts of Canada
To say
on
the
the
least.
policy.
To say the least.
Velma,
But my point is, where we are now is kind of would have been unthinkable 11 years ago after that election, right? You know, and for the entire, and this is where I'm very critical of, you know, to be a little provocative maybe, of the Conservatives of today, because I really think that they missed the boat in this election in positioning the carbon tax all around this is an issue of affordability, right? When most of the country, you know, you had climate action as the #1 issue that people cared about. And no party really differentiated itself around affordability. It was basically a tie around affordability because everyone had all sorts of ideas and promises. But people really cared about this. And so to be offside on that issue, I think, was a real miss.
Okay, but I'm not going in that direction. I'm going to Velma.
All right.
Well,
He's got an example.
I'm going to. So I'm going to riff on this a little bit because I actually think that the effect of the Eco-Fiscal Commission in this last election was to take some of the edge off of what, like if you think of the lead up going into this election, it was all the, you know, the threat of we were going to have premiers coming out to say that the carbon tax was too expensive, and then we were going to sort of repeat the dynamics that we saw in the Ontario election. That actually didn't happen. That really didn't happen, and the edge was taken off some of the straight impact of the arguments around the cost of carbon tax. Because, oh gosh, here we go. There's a whole panel on carbon pricing versus carbon tax. But so I actually think that the Eco-Fiscal Commission served to take some of the edge. Because the thing that I want to talk about, what doesn't work is pendulum swings. What hurts issues is wide pendulum swings, and I want to use 2 examples. So if you are, so you said patience to Ken. If you have an issue that's a long-run issue, that you're looking for big systemic change, and a lot of us work on issues that are like generational issues, systems change issues, electricity, transportation, you know, carbon policy, et cetera. These are long-run issues. So if you go into a jurisdiction and you're arguing way over here, you stand a very high risk that the pendulum will just swing way back. The cost of that pendulum swing, the cost in public policy, the cost in politics, the cost in public understanding, the cost to business. It's a long list, and it is extremely expensive. And I think that if we need a little bit of a debate in this country about what it is that pendulum swing actually costs us, because it's very, very high. 2 specific examples that I would use to sort of make this point would be in 2000, 2001 on species at risk. And I saw this from the inside because at that time I was working for a Minister of the Environment. And what happened was there were a set of people who felt that they were getting their way on the way that the species at risk legislation should go, that the pendulum was switching towards how business would want it implemented. And environmental groups came forward and said, we have a completely different view and we're going to argue. We're betting that our arguments will beat their arguments with these political audiences, so we're going that way. And then it became a huge issue in the 2001 election, and species at risk became incredibly, overly politicized, to the point, I would argue, as a personal opinion, anyone in this room can debate me on this, where we actually still, because I make calculations about things that are political risk. Where political risk is high, public policy movement is low. If political risk is high, public policy movement is low. And so species at risk is still, like, we probably won't talk about it in this minority because who would want to touch species at risk in a minority with the possibility that the dynamics could blow up? The other pendulum swing, in the most recent example, is in Ontario. So you had carbon policy going in a particular direction under Liberal government. It was well entrenched, et cetera. And then Doug Ford came in and just went, nope, all the way over there. And people have spent the last year scrambling to, like literally the carpet was pulled out from under people who were planning, whether they were a renewable energy project or they were a corporation who was planning on how they were pricing emissions or whatever. It was just yanked and everybody had to reset and start again. Those pendulum swings, bad way to go.
And it happened even faster because of the changing conservative leader.
Sure.
On the eve of the election.
Yeah,
right?
of course. No, there's plenty of dynamics in there to
yeah,
talk about
yeah.
because
Within-
Patrick Brown was somewhere else
Patrick
again.
Brown was somewhere
it was
else.
even more unexpected because
Within Environment Canada, I will tell you that we referred to the Species at Risk Act with the ultimate insult, and that was drafted by legislators. That's the worst possible piece of legislation.
I have a slightly different view.
Bruce, counting on you, because you sit in a different chair than these folks in your day job, and I think of you as having kind of maybe one giant step back and maybe a little different perspective on things. What would you give as your example?
Yeah, I mean, two things that I was quite involved in. One was the phase out of coal-fired power plants in Ontario, and the other one was the creation of the Ontario Greenbelt, which I think if you speak to the government people of that day, they will probably describe both of those as their two favorite accomplishments. Just to look at what was behind some of those things, I think the four main elements, and I think we've touched on all of these, is they were both very big ideas that at the time seemed impossible. And it's funny, I go to meetings now, and whether it's with people in the electricity sector or governments, and literally this happens all over the world, people are like, oh yeah, well, Ontario phased out coal. It's like, that was easy. But I can tell you in 1995, sitting in rooms having the first conversations about why do we have a campaign on climate change, a campaign on acid rain, a campaign on smog, a campaign on toxic pollution, when the coal-fired power plants were at the core of all of those things. So the idea was basically, let's just go after coal-fired power plants and let's focus on health. So it was a complete reframing of an issue in a big way. But it was something that, so I guess the second point is you do the research. We actually did research to show that it was quite doable in Ontario. And I've had a lot of conversations with people to suggest that it's actually a lot harder to do it in Saskatchewan for obvious reasons. But in Ontario, it was quite doable, and we made the case that it was doable. We built a constituency, so the point is you can't do these, you can't just have a great policy idea and not build a constituency around it. And Jack Gibbons, who ran the campaign, did a brilliant job of doing that. And to the point where all three major provincial parties in Ontario had it in their platform to phase out coal. So that was like almost unprecedented from an environmental policy perspective. And then the third one is see it through. I mean, this was 15 years of work. So it wasn't, and now it's just like, oh, right, obviously we just phased out coal.
Right.
But the first jurisdiction in the world to come up with the idea and to actually implement it. And if we look at the results, within a year, smog advisories went to zero. If you look at a map of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, you'll see a big bar showing massive reduction in Ontario. That's the coal phase out. So still to this day, it's the single biggest climate or greenhouse gas reduction in North America. But what's interesting, at the time, that's not what drove it. It was all driven by public health and getting the Ontario Medical Association in. So I think a lot to learn from that. And we actually used some of what we learned in that something was created called the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And we basically modeled the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance after the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, but a similar model of doing the research, showing it can be done, thinking big. I still remember one story of a group of environmental organizations talking about creating this Greenbelt. So the Greenbelt is probably the largest urban legislated protective zone around an urban region in the world. And so we're talking about, maybe it should be 300,000 acres or 400 or 500,000 acres. And then one person said, well, why not 800,000 acres? That's what the science says, 800,000 acres. And so everyone was like, oh my God, no, that's impossible. This is my line about don't overthink the politics. The politicians will never go for that. And then it came to the announcement with McGuinty and everyone all excited, wondering, what is the number going to be? And there's Dalton McGuinty saying, we're going to create a 1 million acre greenbelt around Ontario. We're like, 1 million acres? Where did that come from? Like that was even like more than what the science said. So this idea of like thinking big, bringing people along, not being afraid to be bold, and then ultimately doing the research and working super closely with the government, which in both cases, these ideas didn't come from the government, they came from outside of the government, but the government worked very closely and in a super positive way with us to implement them.
I think some comms expert put in that million at the, just as they were editing the press release.
Oh, no.
That's too, that doesn't sound right to me. Million's easier to say. I'll just write that in.
No, I think
There is a role for serendipity in public policy. I want to come back to something that a number of you talked about. And I think what people here want a little more of is looking behind the curtain, because you people all have spent some time behind the curtain. Dan, you talked about zero-sum game. Velma, you talked about pendulum swings. I mean, it seems like a lot of politics is becoming increasingly polarized. If they're in favor of it, I'm diametrically, opposed to it. There's no way. And yet, at the same time, you said, we've got to avoid these pendulum swings. So, what's the? Are we, doomed to having these knock down, drag out fights on these things for purely political reasons? Or is there a way to start with the gap being a little bit narrower, so where we can converge to some good idea or some reasonable variation of a good idea more quickly?
I think it's, everyone agrees that social media is driving our population into pockets that are further and further alienated from each other. And I think our politics is responding to that. But if I can just speak about my own tribe for a minute, within the conservative world these days, the divide is not so much between PC and reform and some of the old social conservatives and economic conservatives. The divide is increasingly between populists and what I would call conservatives. So, the populists, which I'm not one, the populists feed into this narrative, and the populists increasingly use polling to figure out what people want and then find a breezy solution to answer them. I do a lot of work in the Ontario government, but I think buck a beer is something that was a policy driven by polling, and it just wasn't serious. And so I think an antidote to what you're saying is when people like me who write platforms, we have to think about conservative solutions to difficult ideas. And my current obsession is the childcare debate, and I think conservatives need to find something to say about childcare. And if we do the hard work to figure out what's a conservative and economic approach to childcare, it may be different than what the other guys have, but instead of a debate where we're yelling and making people angry, which is the core of populism, we're arguing on the basis of policy that we think will work. And I think if the debate is serious, and I keep coming back to that word, if the debate is serious, then we can have a good debate. If Andrew Scheer's climate policy without a carbon price would have been serious, it might have engendered a better debate. We might have had a debate between the regulatory approach and the tax approach. And so I think I keep coming back to this, and it's hard for a politician to take the time and the effort to develop serious policy. But in the long run, that's the difference between a short-run populist government and a Harper government that took policy quite seriously and lasts a lot longer. You can agree or disagree with Harper, but he did try and find solutions to problems more often than not. Not that he was perfect, of course, and not that everyone has to agree. But I think this idea that you need to develop policy that's serious is one way for those of us on the inside, behind the curtain, to avoid the polarization. I'm not afraid to have a debate with my Liberal and New Democrat colleagues about all kinds of things. There's a reason we disagree. We're ideological beings, and that's okay. But it shouldn't be based on flimsy polling or just emotional debates that have no grounding in difficult, serious policy.
And it's not just populism on the conservative side. I mean, when you look at, for example, the Liberals, I mean, slicing and dicing by urban versus rural, slicing and dicing by income. You know, I mean, everybody's doing it. I mean, Dan, Velma, Bruce, what are there ways of addressing this if you're trying to advance a policy problem? Dan?
Okay, so to come back to where I started on early on, the Charlottetown Accord many, many years ago, but you could almost say the same thing about Brexit, right? You know, you have a situation where the so-called elite, you know, groups in society, those with policy expertise, say this is something we should be pursuing or not pursuing in the case of Brexit, for example. And where those actors often fall down is that they fail to understand that increasingly for a lot of people, we're in a world where the most credible person isn't necessarily someone with expertise. I don't celebrate that. I don't celebrate the fact that Kim Kardashian has more influence than Chris Reagan, right? You know, it should be the other way around, clearly.
Who would have thunk, Chris?
Who's Chris Reagan?
Or Paul Booth, for that matter. But that's the world we're in, right? And so that's why you have the potency of situations where the public has some power, where there's some populist power out there, and a simple phrase like, let's take back control, or make America great again, right? The most key word in let's take back control used for Brexit, which word do you think it is?
Back.
It's the third one. It's back. It's taking back something that belonged to you. And so, man, people with expertise were so vulnerable to, you know, that kind of message. Now, but on the other side, here's what gives me some hope. It's that populists are also weak sometimes, in that populists are vulnerable to a very smart type of communication by a stakeholder who knows how to use symbolism in an effective way, or is able to take advantage of a situation to dramatize an issue.
Yeah. If I could just, I think populists will be defeated by disappointment,
Yes.
because populists can't deliver. And so populism will be defeated by disappointment because their agenda is shallow. It's not a serious agenda.
I agree.
Yeah, to use
use-
but to use a hockey analogy, populism is play-by-play on today.
That's right.
It's play-by-play on dissatisfaction with what's happening around people today.
Yeah.
So,
No, go ahead. I just want,
a defining quote for me, and one that has kept me involved in public policy all these years, despite many frustrations, is Lester R. Brown at the World Watch Institute said, the purpose of politics, the purpose of leadership, is to represent the future to the present. And if we had more debate and more focus on what it was that representing the future to the present, because what was unsatisfying about, at least for me, about the last election was it was a lot of play-by-play, it was a lot of just a snapshot. People were just tapping into how people feel about something today. Now, Greta Thunberg here in Montreal, for those of us who've been going to COP meetings for many, many years, we've always heard that voice at a COP meeting stand up at some point in the meeting and make the speech, and then you know that we have to give voice to the generation that's going to live with the impacts of climate change. But she made it public and popular, and now it has to be factored into things. So the challenge with just doing play-by-play or the immediate leads to the polarization. The long run leads to an understanding that there are some common overlapping. You might disagree on the actual tools you would use to get to that future, but you can see more of a common future.
Yeah.
And I think one of the really tough things for public policymakers, and I know that this is something that Chris will be teaching at Max Bell, and that public policy schools are wrestling with around the country, is that we are making public policy for a future that is different than we can possibly imagine, and about debates that we're not really having. And how is it that you focus a public policy debate on the dynamics of what's changing? So again, just one more thing, Paul. If I think about, for me, the coming to an agreement, the Paris Agreement, all the players that came together, et cetera. What that did is it raised the floor, okay? The floor was raised on where polarization was possible. So you could debate all kinds of other things, but we were done with the everybody, the extremists and all those kinds of things. We raise the floor. So what would it take for us to raise the floor in a number of areas? You all work in different areas. What would it take to raise the floor on your issue, which requires that you find common ground with people who are not of the same view? You can, and there's a Venn diagram. There isn't a public policy issue around that doesn't have a Venn diagram that says, we agree grosso modo on these 10 things. We're going to disagree violently on public policy, or like on the tools.
But I want to speak just for a moment in favor of polarization, okay? Because it's good.
It is.
Serious polarization is good. You know, we had a period in this country where the argument was made that deficits are good. And we had a period in this country where we argued that deficits are bad, and that we ought to be fiscally responsible. And I think over time, the argument that we should be fiscally responsible won that debate. We had a debate about whether free trade was bad. We had an argument that free trade was good, and we ended up with free trade is good. And we have a federation where we have 10 provinces where we can experiment with different approaches across the country. And we should have vigorous debates about the how. And I'm not even afraid to have an aggressive debate. For example, the child care referred earlier was a rather aggressive debate. We had a national figure on national television saying that mothers would use our $100 a month for beer and popcorn. That was an aggressive debate. And we won the debate, and now it's part of the common lexicon. So I think to get there, it's okay to have.
Okay, but
I need to just check, Ken. I would challenge you on your use of the word polarization to describe that, because that to me is not polarization. A healthy debate on a subject is not polarization.
But I agree with that. My point was, quite often in public policy, we talk about we need to find the common ground. And I'm not always sure that, like, I'm fine with not finding common ground. I'm fine with a public debate that doesn't have common ground and one side wins, and then that's the way we go. Not that it has to be big swings, but we've had some big debates where one side won and the other side frankly lost.
But debates mean somebody's listening, right? And that's what's missing in a lot of it.
I accept polarization.
I have one more area. Bruce, get ready, because I need your help with this. I have one more area that I'd like to go into, and we still haven't gone very far behind the curtain. So, Bruce, you know, I'd like you, based on your experience, to talk about the very practical side of this, and that is, who do you talk to? And in particular, given that I'm a former bureaucrat, what's the role of the bureaucracy when you're trying to advance these projects? Because all these strategists, they live up in the sort of cloud of the minister's office, and us poor bureaucrats are down toiling at the coalface day to
Not
day.
the good ones.
And actually, we're the ones that actually get to press the buttons. So Bruce, who do you actually talk to? Like, what's the practical side of this?
Yeah, well, you talk to a lot of people. And we've sort of joke among ourselves that a big part of our job in Ottawa is to make sure that the bureaucrats at NRCan know what the bureaucrats at Environment Canada are doing. Yeah. And that the minister's office at NRCan knows what the minister's office at Environment Canada is doing. So we speak to, we worked very closely, for example, with Steve Lucas, who's, one of my bureaucrat heroes. I don't know who has bureaucrat heroes, but I do. And Steve Lucas is one of them. And so somebody like that, who clearly very smart, understood the system, but can't manage everything. So we would meet with him, and then you meet with the minister's office. And so, what do you think? What do you think? And then you meet with the people who report to Steve, and you meet with the people who report to the people who report to Steve. And then you go over to NRCan, and you do the same thing over there. And then you go to ISET, and then you go to the PMO, and then you do the rounds and have a conversation. And basically, the nature of the conversation is, we think this is where something is going. We think this is what will be good for the country, and we think we can help you, and we want to figure out where can we go together with this. I mean, that's kind of how we work inside. And then we'll bring in experts, and we'll convene meetings in Ottawa, and we'll hire consultants to do reports that explain an issue. And so this is the long game of public policy, and I don't really think any public policy changes or at least gets to the point, and going back to the polarization. And I would still say what Ken was talking about is actually polarization, and that's not bad. It's different than populism. So populism is one thing, polarization is a different thing. They just happen to play together. But so what you want to do is get to the point where, you know, the pendulum swing thing, the pendulum swings less and less each time, to the point where you're no longer debating whether climate policy is a good or bad thing. You're debating the margins of how to do it. You know, we no longer question you know, same-sex marriage. We no longer question, you know, abortion rights. I mean, people on the fringes will still question those things, but public education, public health care, I mean, those all had big pendulum swinging debates over time, but the goal is to get to the point where the fundamental idea, the fundamental good public policy is agreed to by everybody, and then you can debate on the margins, you know, the best way to implement certain elements of it. But it's the long, hard work of, go back to the question, is you talk to as many people as possible, you try to understand what their challenges are, you try to figure out if there's ways that you can help them out. And you know, as I'm sure you know, I mean, the system still in governments is very siloed, and so a big part of our work is to try to move across the silos and you know.
Well, and there's a reason for that. And Dan, I'm going to ask you to respond in a second. But one of the things that people outside the curtain don't get is that often, not always, but ministers are competitors. They're competing for influence in cabinet, right? And now it's good to know where the leaks from Environment Canada, how they got over to NRCan. Because I always told my staff, never tell NRCan what we are working on. I will communicate. And it is interesting. Your hero, Steve Lucas, was formerly a senior official at NRCan before he went to.
Yep.
Well, but the thing that, I mean, my question to you is based on the idea, I mean, at Deputy Minister School, used to be held at the Rideau Club, now Tim Hortons, after Mr. Harper's government. But they tell you that, you know, if you're a good deputy minister, you have to have a portfolio of great policy ideas ready to go. And then when the window of opportunity opens, you're ready to go through. And what I see as the role of the people sitting here is they're window openers, right? They're window openers. But, and we've been talking a bit about that, but Dan, I mean, specifically inside the curtain, how do you work with the bureaucracy to open the window to get these policies rolling?
Yeah, well, no, great question. I mean, let me see if I can paint a picture with a real case study that I think is a good example of how a campaign I was involved in, where we were able to depolarize, you know, positions on it, and that was I guess it was about 15 years ago, and our client was the City of Toronto. So the City of Toronto hires us and says, "We'd like you to whip up public fervor across the country for Toronto getting more money from the federal government." So, needless to say, of course, I'm paraphrasing the RFP a little bit, but you know, but that was essentially it, right? We want Toronto to get more money from the federal government, and so, you know, the mayor was Mel Lastman at the time, whom you'll remember, you know. Some of you may remember, the guy who didn't know who the World Health Organization was, who is who, and all this sort of stuff. And so anyway, and so there was a group of city councilors from all stripes who were behind this idea. And so we're going in there saying, well, this is crazy. Like, first of all, it can't just be Toronto, right? It's got to be every major city in the country. I think you didn't need to be very smart to figure out that that was essential to success. But then it became about, well, okay, well, what's the tone of this? What's the message of this? Like, you know, so we needed to start really, really early and view this as a long-term campaign. So shift number one that we needed to bring to the client's thinking was, it can't just be about Toronto, it's got to be about every big city. Shift number two is, it's not a quick PR campaign, right? It's a long-term process of dialogue and engagement with policymakers in government, but also within parties. It's thinking about what works its way into party leadership campaigns, right? It's identifying, as we did, Paul Martin, before he was Prime Minister, as somebody who was sympathetic to the idea that the economic base of the country had changed. Cities have become much more important. They no longer should be just treated as creatures of the provinces. And, and let's get that into his thinking for his leadership campaign. Dalton McGuinty was not yet Ontario Premier. Let's get this into his thinking. And so over time, we started to shift things. The other thing that was really critical, and the Mayor of Toronto refused to come to the news conference because of this. It's quite a funny story. If you ask me sometime, I'll tell you. But he was out there screaming at the Prime Minister. He was screaming at the Premier. We said, no more screaming. We're now going to go out there with the greatest of confidence and say, we believe that every major politician in Canada, nobody can be serious anymore unless they're willing to support our cities. And so we're going to go from city to city, province to province, every capital. We're going to hold events, and we will celebrate the politicians who come there and stand on the stage with us and say, I will invest in cities. And initially it was mainly opposition politicians that did, but some ministers, policymakers, civil servants were in the audience, right? And over time, the positive approach, celebrating progress, it got us 1.5 cents on the gas tax, which amounted to $2 billion by 2010, and it got us in the City of Toronto Act in Ontario. And this would not have happened had we not taken very much that long-term approach.
I think
Yes, and then we're going to some questions.
Yeah.
quickly on the bureaucrats. I said serious policy. And I'm going to think about this in phases. When a party is trying to get elected, they have a platform that I hope contains a bunch of serious ideas. But the real first test of how serious those ideas are is when you get into government and you give them to bureaucracy to implement. And the role of the bureaucracy then is to pressure test those ideas and to tell us what's doable. But when you get about 2 years into the mandate and you've run out of things in the platform, then the role kind of switches. It tends to switch in most governments where the ideas are now generated from the bottom, by the bureaucrats and rise to the politicians, as opposed to starting with the politicians and falling down. So I tend to think about where the ideas are generated in phases. So in the early mandate of a government, they come from the political platforms, but as a government matures, those ideas tend to be generated by the bureaucracy. And there's different kinds of ideas. I mean, a government, there's sort of maintenance things that need to be done by governments, and there's things you need to maintain policy and update policy, and those are kind of midterm things. And then there's these new ideas and these polarized or non-polarized debates that we have, and those tend to come in the beginning of a mandate. So when you're thinking about ideas that you're working on, think about ideas in those terms. Like, what kind of an idea are you thinking about? Where would it fit in the phase of a government? Because I think the role of the bureaucrat really shifts during a 4-year phase of a government, and the role of political staff really shifts. I mean, they become responsive to the bureaucrats more often, and so I think that's hopefully helpful in terms of thinking about how policy is done.
And Paul, I know you're going into questions, but what we're describing, whatever words we use, polarization or non-polarization, there's a dynamic tension, there's a creative tension that you can understand and capitalize on that exists between officials and the political system and stakeholders and others. It's an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem of actors that has a certain creative and dynamic tension to it. And it's a question of whether you understand that enough so that you can advance and move your issue up to the top of the list.
Okay. So we have some time for some questions. Do we have any brave souls? Okay. So
Thank you. I'll give it back to you. Okay. It seems, I like the idea that you need good evidence-based policy and the communication of it, as if well thought out, rational communication would, solve the problem, or that finding a middle ground between people on the right and the left, as long as they are rational and serious, will get good policy. I think it ignores completely the rise of populism. And our reaction is to say, well, these are despicable people, and their emotions are unrational. They are not grounded on facts, so let's ignore them, which I think is a big mistake. Don't you think that good public policy should also address the emotions, even if they are not well grounded, and incorporate them into good policy?
I completely agree. I mean, I think think of the 2015 election, okay? So populist thinking would say, well, a lot of Canadians were concerned about, a lot of Canadians of certain political persuasion had concerns about immigration, right? And thought that we should be careful about how many people we let into Canada. This was a big issue that was a bit of a hot button in the campaign. What transformed public attention during that campaign in the end? It wasn't stats. It was a story, and more specifically, it was an image. It was an image of a dead child lying face down, representing the crisis, the refugee crisis. And bang, in an instant, that's a moment where populism goes out the window. Because whether it's done through happenstance and serendipity, or it's done through intent by smart stakeholders aligning visual communication and storytelling with the issue that they care about, that's when populism is defeated momentarily, or at least goes into remission. And I think that's what communicators working with policymakers need to think about more. How can we tell stories in a way that's dramatic, and relatable to people? So why is the current Trump impeachment proceeding, whatever happens with it, why is it hitting him so badly, whereas all the 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, a year of the Mueller inquiry didn't? It's because nobody understood the Mueller inquiry. What all these mysterious back and forth, Russia, Here it's very simple. It's something we can all relate to. It's a phone call to a foreign leader, clearly, if it's true, abusing the power of his office, to get something he shouldn't have been asking for in the phone call. Everybody can understand that, so it's got momentum. So often it's not, in policymakers or policy thinkers, policy wonks often say, let me give you all my stats and numbers. But that's where the communications person has to work with them and say, well, let me give you a story.
I have a slightly different approach to that. Can I just quickly?
Yes, but we only have time for one more pithy question. If you
I think
don't
politicians
give a
on the
pithy
right,
answer.
left, and center have been ignoring a segment of our population for a long time. And I think it's incumbent upon anyone who aspires to be a policy person, whether they're on the right, the left, or the center, to figure out what those true concerns of those people are and what policies we need to put in place to solve those things. I've actually withdrawn from political life for a few years to try and do some of that thinking. My friend Sean Speer has been doing a lot of that thinking. He's been writing in the Globe and elsewhere. And I think the Conservatives need to say these opioid crises and other issues around that, homelessness, Conservatives need serious solutions to these problems. But I think all of us, in whatever political stripe we have, Rachel Notley last night said income disparity drives populism, and I think she's right. But we need to have, and these are serious problems, and if we don't address them in serious ways, we're going to continue to see the rise of populism. And I think we're all going to agree on what different solutions are, which is okay, because the opioid crisis is a complicated problem, right? And the lower middle class and the loss of manufacturing and these low skill workers, and how do we find a future for them? That's a complicated problem. And it's not, the corporatists of the Liberals and the tax cuts of the rights and of the Conservatives. Those aren't going to solve problems for these people. So it's hard policy work, working its way into the political system that's ultimately going to find solutions to these people.
I agree
So
with
let's try to get a few more pithy questions and pithy answers. Okay? Here, and then we'll go to Central Canada and Western Canada. Pardon?
Hi, I'm a pure academic at McGill. All I do is research, and I have a few examples of where my colleagues have done amazing research that, as one example on homelessness and what is a cost-effective way to reduce homelessness, especially among the severely mentally ill. And a second, which was then this policy was not taken up by the government, even though there was data showing it was cost effective. Second example is with the flooding and the government deciding on the flood zones, the ZIS, without consulting the climatologists, without consulting the people who actually knew any of the data behind it. So my question is, and the reason that I'm here today is to learn what is the route, what is the pathway that we can take as academics, leaving our
Join a political party.
leaving our office, coming out from behind our computer, and actually taking the results of research and getting somebody to listen to us that something needs to be different. And the example actually I was also thinking about was exactly the boy on the beach, the dead boy on the beach, that an image can make things happen much better than all of our statistics, and our P is less than 0.05. My understanding is that nobody really cares about the academic research that's seriously
Okay.
done.
Great. I'm going to ask Bruce to take a stab at this.
Yeah, actually, I did my PhD on how evidence is used in policymaking, and the answer is it isn't. So how many pages did it take you to see? 400. I think, if you sort of piece together what we're all saying is, having evidence at some point is very useful to understand a problem, and you're not going to get policy without real research. And, to use Ken's word, like, serious policy is based on serious research. But that's probably 1% of policy making. And so the idea, or maybe it's 10 at the maybe, if you're lucky. But really, it's how you pull all of that together with, and I would suggest if in this case, and we work with lots of universities and lots of academics, but really what you need to do is be able to take that research and embed it in a policy process that is designed to change policy. So academic research isn't designed to change policy, it's designed to understand an issue. So until that gets embedded in a formal process that is about changing policy, which means you have to find the organizations that are trying to change that policy, you have to work with them, you have to spend the time, you have to find the resources, and you have to find the political support. So it's a big, lengthy process. The research alone doesn't change policy.
Or you can join a political party. There's lack of smart people. There's lack of smart people in politics, and if you're a smart person in politics, you can go far very fast.
So I would.
I'm not kidding.
No, but he's told us all day he's serious, right?
I've written many things in my life, and almost all of them I've managed to help get implemented. Why? Because I'm in politics.
But I think it strikes me that, there's a parallel between this and, they talk about the pathway for business startups. There's this kind of valley of death, right? And I think there's this big chasm between good ideas that come out of research, right? And then how they become connected. And I think that the need for us to have a way for those ideas to get connected to policy thinkers, political parties, gain visibility. I mean, one of the ways is to have somebody like the Ivey Foundation or the Max Bell Foundation that I work with, take these things on. But I think what you're pointing to is a real gap, missed opportunity to translate this really good thinking that's going on into action. And in fact, in a later panel, when we talk about the Eco-Fiscal Commission, it seems to me that that's one of the areas where they were able to bridge that gap. So, stay tuned. There may be some more to say about this. Let's go where we were going to go to Central Canada here. Any ideas, any questions? Central Canada's pretty happy. We are happy. We're happy.
Hi, Arthur Lofsky. I want to respond to the academic over there. Sorry, I didn't get your name. Ken is right. I was, my previous life, I was Director of Policy in the Minister's Office for Greg Cervera in the Ontario Liberal Government. I happen to be at the center of a lot of these things you've been discussing. My advice to you is, in addition to getting into politics, is try and just look up in the directory who is working at the Ministry of Finance in the minister's office. And there might be a policy guy there who, or gal, who might be interested in things. Finance is an interesting place because everything goes through finance. And he'll either tell you, go to that ministry, or I don't care. But we were always looking for some new ideas. So that would be my piece of advice. And on the Greenbelt, I just want to say that I was in the room where we made the 1 million acre decision, and I'd be happy to discuss how it came about. It was not too far away. There was a guy named MPP Mike Kool. Do you remember him?
Right.
I worked for him, so anyway,
right.
We'll talk about that later.
Okay. Well, we're kind of in Thunder Bay there. Let's go all the way out to Esquimalt.
I wish I could say Esquimalt, more from Ottawa. So let me maybe spark some of that heated debate that we said was good for these issues. Stuart Elgie, I was the guy Velma referred to that made the decision about the Endangered Species Act. So let me give you the other side of the issue, and let's have an honest discussion about strategy in change. So you get, and I should add, by the way, that Velma and I were opponents, and we've been close allies for the last decade running Smart Prosperity, so the world changes. So you get to a point in a lot of campaigns where you get offered some of what you wanted. And you've got to make the decision, is getting some of it enough? And we got to the point, I was running the Endangered Species campaign back then, that we said what David Anderson was offering wasn't good enough. And we won't get into the weeds, but basically they offered a law that said endangered species protection will be optional, and we wanted one that said would be mandatory. And you get these points where people say, well, half a loaf is better than no loaf at all, take some water in your wine, get it through now, come back and strengthen it in 5 or 10 years. Which I think is always this sort of false elixir, because the truth of it is, when you've got your political capital is when you're going to get the best deal. You're not going to come back and strengthen it. So we made a decision that wasn't good enough. It did provoke some controversy. Looking back, I would argue that the controversy was worth it. Some of the things I would say is we spent less than $1 million a year on endangered species protection then. Now we spend more than $50 million a year federally. We just put through a package of over $1 billion for biodiversity conservation, which wouldn't have happened if we didn't have an action-forcing Endangered Species Act. There was some polarization, but the truth of it is we'd spent 5 years building industry groups that actually wanted a stronger law than the minister was putting forward. We had Forestry and Mining Association people lobbying the minister for a stronger law, and we thought, you know what, we can do it. So Paul's right, we used parliamentary committees to rewrite the law. That created some controversy. If I were to do it over again, I would not have gotten to the point of that polarization with the minister. But given where it was, I think it was my calculus would be it was worth doing it. And I think part of the proof in the pudding is when the Conservatives came in, they ripped up the federal government, the previous government's climate laws, environmental assessment laws, and water pollution laws, but they didn't rip up the Endangered Species Act. So it wasn't that polarized in that it didn't get ripped up when governments changed. So let me stoke some controversy with that, but also push the larger question that Bruce may have something to say on too, or Dan. What do you do when you're offered part of what you want? Like, what if you got a 200,000 hectare greenbelt? Or what if you got a gradual reduction in coal power? At what point do you say, let's take some of what we wanted and come back and fight it again in 5 to 10 years? Because that comes up a lot in many of these issues that you deal with.
That's a great question.
I have a 2-second answer to that one. So I think, and I'll use carbon pricing, which we'll talk more about today. So I think carbon pricing is something that is easily scalable, and it's a big, tough issue. So carbon pricing, if we had gone in and said, we're not happy unless it's $100 a ton, it would have never flown. $20 is way too low, clearly. However, the infrastructure is there, the debate has happened. I would argue that we're on the other side of, or coming out of the other side of that debate. Every province, whether they want to call it a carbon tax or not, is pricing carbon in some way right now. And so the game over time is, how do we make it, how do you get it better harmonized, how do you make it more efficient, and how do you get the price up to a level that matters? Other things that might be lines in sand, like the Species Act, I think are tougher. I think you have to make a judgment call that's specific to the policy. Yeah. And it's the debate that we all have. Tim and I have these debates about, what's tough enough or not, and when do you believe that you've gone as far as you can to get as much as you can And that's going to be a judgment call, and different people have different constituencies and different perspectives. But so it could go either way, but it's a big debate in policy for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, Stuart's accurately described. So from Stuart's perspective, that was a raising the floor move on species at risk, and everything that's happened since, et cetera. So fair ball. I would argue it came with a very high political cost in an overall system about whether there was political upside for politicians to work with environmental groups, because it had a chill effect ongoing on a number of other things. But Stuart and I have debated this many, many times in the last 20 years, so we don't need to touch on it.
And very hard to implement and enforce. In fact, Species at Risk Act is basically implemented by the courts. Bureaucrats, it can't be done by bureaucrats.
So, but on the point of, so where do you make a decision that you're getting enough? Because it's like, are we making step change, or are we okay with an incremental change, knowing that an incremental change will Tarzan swing you to the next change, to the next change, to the next change. So it's always an assessment, but you have to, and Stuart's describing a set of circumstances where he very clearly made an assessment that based on the landscape that was in front of him, it was worth it and they could push it through and they could get it done, and he in fact was right. But I started by saying, know your landscape, execute with discipline, and then be prepared to adapt, because the circumstances change, and if you're effective in the campaign, you want to talk about going behind the curtain, we assess and reassess and reassess and reassess and reassess and reassess. Because if you're doing your job, you're having an impact on a system, on that broader ecosystem and that dynamic. And if you're having an impact, then it's possible for you to decide, I can go further, or I need to stop here because this is as far as this particular circumstance.
But what Bruce was talking about in the example he used was building the machine. Building the machine to tackle climate change, not this is it, we're tackling it, we're getting this issue off the table.
And I think there are two things. I completely agree with what Bruce and Velma are saying. Like it's do you have, in terms of your half a loaf, right? Is it the right half of the loaf? Is it the half that gives you the infrastructure, the foundation, all these metaphors, the Tarzan swing, capabilities.
Or is it starter yeast?
Does it give you a starting point? But the other thing that I think is important, which is often overlooked, is just really doing getting an analytical sense of the momentum that you have. Do you have momentum on this issue, right? And can you use that to your advantage? So, like even around social media, a lot of people who are analyzing social media are doing it in a very simple, overly simplistic way. They're just saying, what's the sentiment? Well, sentiment doesn't matter nearly as much as momentum. Who's talking about something? Who is going to be talking about it? And then doing some scenario planning. Well, what could happen that could affect where we go on this issue, right? And how does our coalition feel about that? And I think having a sense of your stakeholders there is really important.
So we have time for one more. So we'll go to Bathurst, New Brunswick, whose hand is up right there.
Not Andrew Leach.
Paul should know that Mayor Maché is not Bathurst. But thanks. So I had a question about the link between partisanship and policy. And we've mentioned a couple of different climate policies. Ken talked about regulation versus pricing, but it all got me, and we're sort of declaring victory on carbon pricing. I think one of the two policies I want to highlight. I think we've had the most stringent climate policy yet presented federally or provincially anywhere in Canada remains Harper's Turning the Corner plan. And part of the reason that didn't get through, by a long shot, I'll argue that, read it. And the other one is Rachel Notley's climate plan that I had a piece of. And both of them, I would argue, the success of Rachel Notley's being able to get in but not being able to stay was partly partisan, but I don't know that a Conservative could have done it. I think another party pitching Harper's plan, it reads very differently. So I'm curious as to how the link between those partisan lines and policy lines plays out for all of them.
Interesting.
Any pithy responses to that extremely hard question?
Well, so Harper's plan was $65. The there was a $65 price in that, and you know, it's like everything becomes relative, and they just couldn't get that to work. They tried to frame it as a health issue and reframe it in a different way, and
But I think maybe the question is, it got torpedoed for partisan reasons, not because of the technical details.
I think my answer to your question is that politicians at the end of the day have to respond to the public demand for things. And I think what we've seen in the last election is that the public demand for a coherent climate change policy in the 905 will force the Conservative Party to get serious about this issue.
Yeah.
And when they start getting serious about this issue and start looking at what the serious policy of this issue, that's not a left-wing, bigger government, more regulation, interference in the economy, they're going to come to a very easy conclusion. But until then, they've been playing this useful populist fight. And so I think political parties do swing between, as you've just demonstrated. I mean, the BC NDP went from fighting the carbon price to supporting the carbon price. Yeah. But I think, you know, I said what politicians shouldn't do is let polling drive policy. But once you have a bunch of policies in place, you do need to poll, and you do need to find where the public is. And I think at the end of the day, we need to have the public tends to get ahead of where politicians are, and if they get too far ahead, as they did on deficit reduction and a bunch of other things, politicians need to respond to that. And then it's the politicians that are the most serious that will get there.
And that uses up all of our time. So thank you. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, Paul.